A few years ago, I got the chance to take a trip to Iceland. Iceland is breathtaking. The landscape almost surreal in places, unlike anywhere I'd ever been. The number of rainbows and waterfalls I saw felt astounding. But perhaps surprisingly, the physical beauty of Iceland is not what first put it on my radar as somewhere I was interested in visiting. Years ago, I read a book called The Geography of Bliss by journalist Eric Weiner. In the book, the author delves into happiness studies and visits both the happiest and unhappiest countries in the world. In each location, he writes about what it is about the culture, the landscape, and people that lead to its ranking as happiest or unhappiest. The chapter about Iceland is titled, "Happiness is Failure." As someone born and raised in the US, conditioned by capitalism and a Protestant work ethic, the title seemed oxymoronic. Failure is bad, duh. How could failing make people happy? Weiner writes, Iceland was an essential aspect on my journey to discover contentment. This country has consistently ranked in the top percentile, if not number one, of the happiest places in the world. After questioning many native Icelanders, I had come to the conclusion that this is because failure is admired in their culture. They like to try and learn new things, even if they know the end result will not necessarily be a masterpiece. This explains why it seems like absolutely everyone in Iceland is a poet or an artist of some sort, or why so many teenagers have garage bands with no hope of success. I imagine the lack of pressure to succeed only caused more success and a deeper understanding of one's inner self. He goes on to say, the more I thought about this, the more it made sense. For if you are free to fail, you are free to try. We Americans like to think that we too embrace failure, and it's true to a point. We love a good failure story, as long as it ends with success. As long as it ends with success, a comeback, Americans love a good underdog story. Right now, the Olympics have just gotten underway, and, as always, there are many stories about athletes who have had to overcome many obstacles to make it to Paris and the Olympic Games. Someone in the spotlight this year is Simone Biles, gymnast and winner of 37 world and Olympic medals. Biles was in the spotlight back in 2021 as well, but that time it was for leaving gymnastics and not competing in a final Olympic event in Tokyo. In 2021, America was talking about the travesty of her leaving gymnastics. Even those who praised her for taking care of herself and her mental health probably would not have called her 2021 Olympics a success. Now she is being cheered on for making a comeback. Her story of failure is okay because she is back in the saddle with more chances of winning. But what if she hadn't come back? What if she had decided that her time as a world-class athlete was over and she pivoted and started a garage band? Maybe if she was Icelandic, her fellow country folk would have patted her on the back and lent her an electric guitar to get started. In America, I can only imagine people's devastation at her perceived failure and the loss of such an amazing gymnastic talent. Blogger Bright Wanderer writes on her Tumblr page, I think a lot about how we as a culture have turned forever into the only acceptable definition of success. Like, if you open a coffee shop and you run it for a while and it makes you happy, but then stuff gets too expensive and stressful and you want to do something else and so you close it, it's a failed business. If you write a book or two and then decide you don't actually want to keep doing that, you are a failed writer. If you marry someone and that marriage is good for a while and then it stops working and you get divorced, it's a failed marriage. The only acceptable win condition is that you keep doing a thing forever. A friendship that lasts for a few years, but then its time is done and you move on, is considered less valuable or not a real friendship. A hobby that you do for a while and then are done with is a phase, or alternately, a pity that you don't do that thing anymore. And I just think that something can be good and also end, and that the thing was still good. And it's okay to be sad that it ended too. But the idea that anything that ends is automatically less than this hypothetical, eternal state of success, I don't think that's doing us any good at all. I think Bright Wanderer really hits the proverbial nail on the head here. I see the issue as twofold. In our culture, we are told that failure is bad with a capital B. Failure is equated to being less than. Success is such a vital part of the American dream. Pair that with what Bright Wanderer talks about, forever being the only acceptable definition of success, and we set ourselves up for a heck of a time. Can you think of a time when fear of being seen as a failure kept you in a situation that was ultimately unhealthy for you? Maybe the fear of failing wasn't that strong, but it did color your decision-making process. What will others think or say if I can't keep X, Y, or Z going? Will I be embarrassed, ashamed, that I couldn't maintain something forever, even when it stopped being what I wanted or needed? We can often think of the fear of failure as preventing us from trying something new. But this line of thinking turns that idea on its head in a way. Instead of the fear of failure preventing us from trying new things, it can keep us somewhere that no longer suits us. When my first marriage ended, I quickly made my way to therapy. I had a lot of healing to do, both from my marriage and from being a human, a queer female, plus-size human, living in a human world for 30 plus years. I worked with my therapist weekly for somewhere between 7 and 8 years before I graduated. After working through people-pleasing and unhealthy caregiving through self-sacrifice, issues of self-worth and self-love, and a whole host of other things, I really started to see my life differently. I remember a conversation with my therapist near the end of our time together, where an analogy about ice cream popped into my head. I told her that almost the whole time we were working together, I was moving out of a reactionary survival mode. Like, I lived in a world where I didn't ever have ice cream. And then I got to a place where I was stable and doing well. And there it was, a bowl of vanilla ice cream. And that was a huge success. Whoever thought I would have made so much progress? But things were shifting again, and all of a sudden I realized maybe there was more to life than plain vanilla ice cream. Like, what about toppings? Whipped cream, marshmallow, chocolate sauce. It was a revelation to realize that there could be more to life than maintaining. Is this what people mean when they say thriving? The idea that I could choose me and place importance on my own desires was new and raw and exciting and terrifying. And here we return to my trip to Iceland. Actually, it was originally a trip to Peru, trekking to Machu Picchu. However, that was scheduled for June of 2020, and thanks to a worldwide pandemic, didn't happen. Solo travel and outdoor adventuring were some of the metaphorical toppings I wanted to try out. I found a women's travel company that had trips specifically for plus-size women that wanted outdoor adventure experiences. I remember sitting in the airport in Denver, so nervous that the trip would be too hard, physically and/or emotionally. Over the loudspeaker came an announcement about incoming tornadoes, and I momentarily thought, yes, I don't have to go. My flight will be canceled and I can just go home. However, the tornadoes passed, and my flight left on time. In the Iceland chapter in The Geography of Bliss, the author talks to an Icelander who suggests part of why failure is embraced is that Iceland has less envy and jealousy than other countries. When one isn't envious of another's success, one's fear of failing is diminished. While the women on my trip weren't Icelandic themselves, I feel like we tapped into this spirit. Not all of us did all of the same activities. One day, we went with a tour guide to walk on a glacier. The word walk was a bit of a stretch, as the activity involved crampons, helmets, and trekking poles. This was no walk onto the smooth surface of a frozen lake. Shortly after making our way onto a glacier, things got steep, up and down, and also narrow. Myself and another woman quickly hit our limit and turned back early. There was no shame in this. No one made us feel less because we didn't do the whole walk. We didn't fail at this activity. One of the mantras of the group was, everyone hikes their own hike, meaning that everyone has their own experience and we're not here to compete with each other. Things end. And this may happen of our own choosing, or it may be out of our hands. My walk on a glacier ended. My marriage ended. And I was not without feelings of failure in those moments. However, looking back, I take in what Bright Wanderer said. Endings aren't always failures. I appreciate this because I am not yet as enlightened as the Icelandic people, and I still struggle with what failing feels like in our culture. Seeing a thing that ends as a failure robs us and the experience from any joy and value that it held. One of the hardest things I think we do as humans is hold dualities, being both happy and sad at the same time. I've seen a quote floating around on social media that says something like, I wake up and look around and see devastation and war and suffering. The artist wakes up and looks around and also sees beauty and hope. Endings are hard. I will never dispute that. But Bright Wanderer reminds us that something can be good and also end. And that thing was still good. And it's okay to be sad that it ended too. The grief in endings is all too real. Stripping away its value does nothing but make it worse. Grief is more than enough, without a side helping of shame that comes from failing in our Western culture. Trees lose their leaves, not staying lush and green year-round, and they are not failures. Wildfires burn forests, but make way for new growth. The only constant in life is change. And change means some things end and new things begin. We live in a world of cycles, seasons, lunar cycles, birth, death, rebirth. Nothing continues on as it is forever. Why then do we make that a measure of success? I am not a fan of cliches, which itself is probably a cliche, but I find myself leaning into the idea that it is the journey and not the destination that life is about. Outcomes are important, but they are not the sum total of success. Did you learn something along the way? Did you have fun? Was some purpose served by your experience? Human existence persists at meaning-making, consciously or unconsciously. I invite you, in the coming days, to play with the idea that things ending is not indicative of those things being failures, and with the idea that failure itself might not be all that bad.